Hello everyone. The reason why 99.9% of us aren't enlightened is because it's a million times harder to see your own ego, and it's a million times easier to notice other people's egos. The reason why is because our ego is the individualized identity. Who we are, we're already enlightened, but it's our enlightenmentness that identifies with this individual character, which gets taught from birth, pretty much from when you're 2 years old. First you have to learn language to have an ego, pretty much, except you do sort of, you can absorb it on an energetic level, on a non-linguistic level, but that's how our ego gets built. First you get language, you get ideas, and then through those ideas our egos make a composite of an identity. And the reason why it's so hard, enlightenment, is because it's in us. It's our ego, and it's speaking on our behalf, it's talking on our behalf, it's making judgments on our behalf, and then within a split second of it making its judgments, it's reacting to its own judgment. And this process happens so quickly and unassumingly within us, that's where this assumption process keeps occurring and repeating itself like Groundhog Day every day. So the way out of into enlightenment is to use your enlightenmentness, which is you, to look at your ego and bring a distinguishment and discernment between you and it. And as you do so every day, you build this distinguishment and discernment, and it grows within you, and then you're able to distinguish yourself between you and your ego. Generally speaking, who you are is ever perfect, ever immaculate, untouchable. Examples of this is sort of when we're relaxed, our ego's temporarily switched offline. And our ego comes online, sometimes it sits quiet for a few days, or sometimes it's online and offline maybe several times a day. It comes, especially when you wake up in the morning, sometimes the ego doesn't switch online for a little bit, if you're pretty relaxed as you're waking up. But so that's the process to enlightenment. It's we assume so much that whatever's speaking on our behalf, reacting on our behalf, and being disturbed on our behalf is us, but it's not. That's our ego. And the biggest probably direction for enlightenment is to sort of recognize that when you're relaxed, there's no disturbance. So the aspect of who we are is absolutely untouchable. And the reason why is because it's not an individual anymore. It's not a bunch of concepts in our mind. It's not a somebody. And in order to be disturbed, you must be a somebody. And this is what's actually being disturbed. It's the somebody personal identity character, which is fictitious, which comes online, offline. It's not constant. Who we are is the ever constant observer. That's the only thing. Constant within us, which is the real us, which is us, the enlightenment. So that's the guideline you can use for enlightenment. Is that whenever something's disturbed, it's always your ego. And if you pay attention and look closely after the disturbance has happened, you'll always notice your ego made or 99% of the time, you'll notice your ego made a judgment half a second to a second before it got disturbed of its own judgment. The reason why I know this is because I became enlightened about 5 years ago. I've mentioned it many times, so I won't go into the story again. It only lasted for 1.5 days. But in that time, when my ego completely disappeared, when I woke up in the morning, only once the ego spoke. It spoke about towards the end of the night, and I opened the security door and I went outside. It was the first time I went outside, and as I went out, the air was illuminating orange. And as soon as that happened, within a second, my ego's first time it spoke in about 12 hours, it said, "You better go to a hospital, you're having a stroke." And then within a half a second, it became disturbed and fearful of its own comment. And then my enlightenment was just watch that like it was absolutely nothing, and then in 1 or 2 seconds that just washed away like it was a grain of sand in the biggest ocean, in the biggest oceans of the world. So that was the distinguishment process that I realized when this enlightenment happened 5 years ago. Because there was absolute silence for the 1.5 days, there was no disturbances anymore. There was no more Peter character anymore as a somebody to be disturbed. And it's absolutely impossible to imagine when you are enlightened, when the ego disappears, what it's like to be unenlightened, to have an ego anymore. It's like, how can you have a personal identity which is consists of ideas, and here it is here, and you focus on those ideas and then let that speak on your behalf, let it talk on your behalf, and let it react to its own judgments on your behalf. How can you do that? It will be absolutely impossible to imagine what it's like to be in an ego state. And the reverse is opposite for us, which I still have an ego. For us that have an ego, it's impossible to imagine what it's like to live without a personal identity idea. But the main thing to acknowledge is it's just an idea. Also the main thing to acknowledge is it switches online and offline. It's not constant. How can something that's not constant be you? And it can't be. It's impossible. And the other thing to acknowledge is that when you were 2 years old, the ego wasn't even developed yet, because you didn't even know language in order to make up stories of the past and the future, worries of the future and regrets of the past. You couldn't do all that yet. First, you need a mind to develop. You need to learn language. And yes, you do absorb it energetically as soon as you're born. You absorb it off your parents. But yeah. So it's actually the 4-year-old ego that you have is different to the 10-year-old ego that you have. So it's constantly being upgraded and added upon, and then files are being deleted. And the way files get deleted is because your awareness, your enlightenmentness sees the falseness of a particular fragment of your ego. It keeps repeating itself over and over, and then it eventually gets to the point where it can't repeat itself anymore, because you develop that distinguishment and discernment to see that you aren't that. So then it morphs into some other different idea. And that's what our ego keeps doing. It keeps, once one bunch of ideas dies, another one takes its place. But it is possible to stop a new idea taking its place by allowing the death of that idea that dissolved. And then no new ideas will take its place. And eventually all the ideas begin to crumble until there's no ideas left. And then you see the core root of our ego, which is this somebody character, which is just an idea. And that's what causes enlightenment inevitably in the end. So if you keep developing this distinguishment and discernment every day when you just live your life, go about living your life normally, and whenever you get disturbed, pay attention. So that's what I did. I've been doing mindfulness for 20 years now. That's what I did. I did it absolute, dedicated in the first year, and I had enlightenment experience every day it was happening, because I saw these structures that were repeating themselves for 25 years or 30 years, and the first time I watched them in my life, I could see that this judgment structure was been repeating itself like Groundhog Day for 30 years, and I'd completely identified with it, and my ego was never-endingly in a dialogue with itself, and I was identified with the dialoguer, with the one reacting, the one disturbed to its own reactions, all of it, like everyone is. That's ego. And I was assumed that all of this is me because it's within me. And that's what causes the unenlightenment. We just keep assuming over and over again every day like Groundhog Day. And what breaks this what breaks this cycle is that you develop this distinguishment and discernment between you and it. You can see it's just an idea. It keeps repeating itself. It usually repeats itself at certain triggers, whether it happens to be with relationships, with money, over stories of what the ego told itself of the past, which is ultimately, everything of the past is ultimately neutral. It's just because this ego made a story out of it, and through that story it made an identity out of it. And that's why the things that used to make us cry now make us laugh. That means some of the old stories that the ego judged when we were 6 years old, they dissolved when we were 18 years old, for example. And then now we don't get disturbed over these certain situations anymore. So and that's because naturally we did mindfulness normally So everyone's already doing mindfulness naturally. But what I'm talking about can accelerate the process if you do it in a deliberate, conscious manner. To see, go about your day. Yep, is there a disturbance? Maybe the average person, I don't know, for me, I get, my ego gets about maybe 20, 30 disturbances a day. It complains over the traffic, it complains over money or past relationships or whatever. And then I bring my mindfulness to see the story it's making about all those situations. So the 6 things the ego complains about: what someone did, what they didn't do, what they said, what they didn't say, what happened and what didn't happen. And when you see, when you bring this into cognition, you see it doesn't matter what happens in life. The ego is always going to complain, and that's the way it builds an identity, through complaining and resistance to what is, which is madness, and that's why some things that make you laugh, the guy sitting next to you or the whoever's sitting next to you, they're crying. Same situation you both went through. That's because you don't have those certain structures that they have. So their filters of experience through their ego is different than yours. And the reverse is opposite. Maybe your friend might be laughing sometimes in a situation and your ego is making a big fuss out of it. So that's the tips, guys. Bring a distinguishment and discernment to your ego every day, and eventually you get stronger in awareness, and your ego begins to weaken and lessen, and then hopefully maybe it might reach the point one day that enlightenment happens, where you don't buy into the story anymore. Shop's closed. You're just an idea, ego, and I don't believe in you anymore. You sound very true. You've sounded like me for many years, but I don't believe you anymore. Thank you.